A very warm welcome to our webinar event on water sharing in the Himalayas. How do the India-China border skirmishes affect the future of transboundary water cooperation on South Asian rivers? Which is hosted by the Asian Institute of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and co-sponsored by the Institute of Water Innovation and the Faculty of Applied Sciences and Engineering at the University of Toronto. My name is Bharat Punjabi. I teach at the Asian Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you and the panelists to today's event. I'll be the moderator for today's event, but before I introduce our speakers and the event's format and theme, I and we at the University of Toronto and the community wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Today's event was largely an outcome of what is now a widely reported belief that the recent India-China skirmishes mark a major geopolitical watershed in Asia. For those of you who aren't familiar, several Indian and Chinese soldiers were killed in the late spring, early summer in Ladakh on the India-Chinese border. And India, in the context of, the broader context being that India and China have an unresolved border dispute, and this particular skirmish arose in that context. Now, the standoff continues even as the Kashmir region has become the focal point of conflict between traditional rivals, India and Pakistan. Today's panel was organized to focus both on the consequences of the India-China standoff and its implications for water sharing between the various Himalayan neighbors. I want to emphasize on why this is important. Most of the rivers in Asia that flow into South and Southeast Asia originate in Tibet. And this makes transboundary river agreements very, very central to peace. And our panelists will tell us why this is important and why these new border tensions between the Asian giants could impact the future prospects of peace, not only in South Asia, but across the continent. So to discuss these issues, we have Dr. David Michel from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, our first speaker, who will give us some background on hydro diplomacy initiatives in the region and will also tell us how these recent tensions between the Asian giants impact India's water agreements with its smaller neighbors, namely Bhutan and Nepal. Following David, Professor Kurian, who has joined us from New Delhi from the Center for Policy Research, which is a think tank in India, will be sharing with us our perspective on how the current border standoff affects the prospects for peace and potential water agreements between China and its downstream neighbors in the eastern Himalayas, especially on the Brahmaputra River. And lastly, Dr. Zafar Adil, who's joining us from Simon Fraser University, will be speaking on the Indus River Basin issues and how they relate to China. Dr. Adil has worked for a long time on transboundary issues, river issues in Asia, and he's a professor of professional practice at the School of Resources and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University. He is also executive director of the Pacific Water Research Center at SFU. Now, I'd just like to mention briefly as the format, our panelists are going to have PowerPoint presentations, except for Dr. Kurian, who's going to speak directly to us. And this will be followed by a Q&A session. You can send me the Q&A, your questions through the Q&A chat on your Zoom. And if you have any issues, please contact us through the chat screen. Now, I would also like to thank you again for attending today's webinar. And with that, I hand it over to Dr. Michel.
Thank you very much, Bharat, and my thanks to the Asian Institute, the Munk School, and the Institute for Water Innovation. My thanks to all of you for being with us, and also to Adil and Nimi, of course, for joining me on this very interesting panel. I'm going to start sharing my screen so that I can share with you my PowerPoint presentation. My name is David Meckel. I'm a senior researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. And I'd like to begin by setting the scene for the geopolitical stakes of water sharing in the Himalayas, and set the background for what the water diplomacy initiatives and the border challenges, the issues that they raise in the region. So the Himalayan region, as Bharat recently mentioned, is the source of 10 major rivers in the Asian continent. 8 of those are transboundary rivers shared by more than 2 countries, including the Indus and the Ganges systems, but also, of course, the Mekong, the Salween, the Irrawaddy, and that these basins are home to almost 1.5 billion people. And these figures for the different rivers that you're seeing here are the population figures only for the inhabitants living within the boundaries of the basins. So we should not forget to note that the waters in these rivers are helping meet the needs not only of people who are living physically within the boundaries of the basins, but are also supporting populations outside of the basins, in the sense that hydropower generated on these rivers or agricultural production from the waters of these rivers can meet the needs of people living beyond the physical boundaries of the river basins. So these river systems are the lifeblood of economies and food security for billions of people in the Asian continent. And when we talk about water sharing or the transboundary nature of these rivers, what we need to emphasize is the extent of the degree to which countries in the region receive waters from upstream and beyond their borders in neighboring regions. So just looking along the border of China with its neighbors here in this map, you can see 181 cubic kilometers of water entering northern India on the Indus system across the border with China, or for another example, 210 cubic kilometers of water entering India from Nepal. So the water flows in these transboundary systems are quite significant, and underlines the degree to which the populations and the economies of these countries depend upon water that they are sharing with their neighbors. And in this graphic, you could see the extent, the percentage to which different countries rely on waters coming from over their borders, and the asymmetry of these dependencies in that, if you look at China in the lower left, you see China only receiving a very, very small proportion of its water from other countries, and then rising from Nepal, Myanmar, India, receiving about 30% of the water that it uses from beyond its borders, rising up to Pakistan and Bangladesh. Pakistan, for example, being almost entirely dependent on the waters of the Indus system, 75% of that water coming from over its borders. And these waters are supporting not only drinking water and domestic consumption for populations, but are partly a wider system of livelihoods and food security and energy generation and ecosystem support. It's commonly referred to as the water energy food nexus, which essentially means that it takes water to grow food and to produce energy, whether that be through hydropower generation or through the cooling of thermal power plants, or the water used in the mining of coal and energy resources. And it also takes water to grow food, and it takes energy to ship and store food and to cook food, and agricultural resources, food resources can be used to generate energy, and the agricultural practices, where crops are grown, how they're grown, has a significant impact on the water cycle. So when we speak about the transboundary water sharing, when we speak about the politics of water management and development in the region, it's important to bear in mind that we're also discussing the agricultural livelihoods of millions of people, the generation of electricity for hundreds of millions of people. And in fact, if we take a look at the water usage in the basins in the region, you can see here that the percentage of hydropower in the total energy generation of Bangladesh, China, India, and Nepal is in that second to the left-hand column, and the hydroelectric production as a share of total energy production is in the next column over. So for a country like Nepal, for example, 100% of their energy production comes from hydropower. And in the Indus Basin particularly, there's a significant undeveloped hydropower capacity that is of political and economic interest to the countries of the basin to meet their rising energy needs. But most of the water withdrawn in the Asian basins is going to agriculture. So in the greater Ganges-Brahmaputra Mekong Basin, 90% of water withdrawals are going to irrigation and agricultural production. In the Indus Basin, that figure rises to 97%. So water supplies are absolutely critical to the agricultural economies of the countries in the region, which is supplying not only food production, but in countries like India and Pakistan, is supplying up to a fifth or more of employment and a fifth or more of GDP in the agricultural sector alone. This water demand is having important impacts on the overall water cycle and water availability. The Ganges and the Indus basins are among the most heavily irrigated areas on Earth, which you see in this map in those red bands in the northern part of the subcontinent, is indicating the degree to which those economies and those agricultural systems depend upon irrigation. The demands for water across the region are posing major stresses in terms of the available water resources overall. That in this global map, the dark red and brown colors indicate the ratio of water withdrawn from those river basins to the renewable water supplies that are actually available. And you can see in the Indus Basin, for example, that almost all of the available water supplies in the Indus are withdrawn over the course of the year, and that this basin is increasingly closed in terms of hydrologists. Speaking of closed basins, when there's very little or hardly any annual renewable water supplies left over to accommodate new users or to accommodate new needs, that almost all of the available water in the basin is being used to meet either ecosystem demands or various human demands, like those for agricultural production or municipal drinking water supplies, etc. Stress on groundwater systems is also rising. That here again, those dark red areas in the northern subcontinent correspond to areas of increasing groundwater stress, and the maps in the upper right-hand corner actually indicate the degree to which the region is losing groundwater supplies, that those water supplies are being overdrafted, overexploited on an annual basis. And the extent of the water losses there are so great that they can actually be seen from space by satellites measuring the way in which depleting groundwater supplies changes the Earth's gravitational field. And the Indus Basin and the Ganges Basin region are losing tens of cubic kilometers per year in overexploited groundwater, all of which is going to drive increasing water scarcity in the region as a whole. This global map shows the number of months of the year in which blue water supplies, meaning surface water, rivers and lakes, and groundwater supplies, that the consumption of those supplies exceeds the available resources. And here again, you see along that Himalayan border region of northern India, Pakistan, along the border with China, the annual, the number of months of 8, 9, 10, 12 months of the year in which blue water consumption exceeds available supplies, raising the stakes for how water is managed and shared across the region. Climate change is going to make these impacts, these stresses worse. I apologize, this is a somewhat complicated chart, but basically what it is indicating is that when the pressures of climate change, which are altering precipitation patterns in the region, changing the arrival and the precipitation from the monsoon, contributing to the melting of the glaciers in the Himalayas that form seasonal water reservoirs for the rivers of the region. Seasonally, water in the form of snow and precipitation accumulates in the glaciers and then melts during the summer months, supplying water downstream as an important component of water flow in the Asian river basins. And when you add the changes from climate impacts to the rising socioeconomic demands of growing populations and growing economies, the water gap between the available blue water supplies, that's surface water and groundwater, and the usage by the end of the century under different climate change scenarios, the water gaps are increasing by, in the Indus Basin, up to 7%, and in the Ganges Basin up to 14% by the end of the century, meaning that there will be significant unmet water demand in those basins. The impacts of water scarcity on the region could be colossal. This is a World Bank scenario projection looking just out in the next few decades, the year 2050, and under business as usual scenarios in which new policies are not implemented to more effectively manage water supplies. The impacts on GDP, not only of the Himalayan region, but of Asia and Africa more broadly, could rise to 6% or more. In this graphic, all of the all of the red regions are experiencing economic impacts of GDP losses of more than 6% a year under business as usual scenario. How are countries going to adapt and cope with these challenges puts additional pressure on the water sharing regimes, on hydrodiplomacy, on border management in the region, in that the impacts of different policy choices reverberate across the region because the water sources are shared, because these rivers are transboundary rivers. The impacts of policy decisions made by one country can significantly affect its neighbors. And in the next few maps, are illustrating the distribution of either existing or planned dams through the Himalayan region on transboundary rivers, on shared rivers. This map shows planned dams in India. The following map is dams on the Brahmaputra River showing here on the Chinese side compared to the previous map, in which over on the right you can see maps on the Indian region of Arunachal Pradesh. Here you see the number of large dams and barrages on the Indus River system, whether they're being used for irrigation or generation of hydropower. And all of these dams have impacts on the surrounding areas and on the regions downstream, in that constructing dams, operating them, storing water in the reservoirs behind these dams all have effects for downstream water flows, changing potentially the timing of water flows, the amount of water flows, changing the flows of nutrients and sediments downstream, so that management decisions made by each of these countries has significant impacts can have significant impacts on their neighbors and on the water availability and the water risks experienced by those neighbors. These combined effects of the rising demands, the environmental pressures, and the political challenges of managing these shared water resources are such that analyses of transboundary hotspots for climate change pressures, as well as water management and development overall, highlight the Himalayan rivers, these shared basins, the Ganges, the Indus, the Brahmaputra, as being hotspots for potential tensions and possible conflicts in the future over how to manage these resources. So these are the overarching geopolitical and hydropolitical stakes for the basins in the region. And how are these related specifically to the recent border clashes? There have been accounts in the press that one of the motivating factors for the border contests in this region is the search for control over water resources, and in particular in the Galwan Valley, the Galwan River Valley, where the fatal clashes occurred. There has been some reporting that the Chinese forces in the region actually blocked the river for some unreported amount of time and in an unreported, uncertain fashion, but that the search for control along the borderline is, according to these accounts, in part motivated by the search for control over the areas through which these rivers pass. And there is a larger sense in which large, the border disputes are related to transboundary rivers and to the boundaries of transboundary basins, in that under the British mapping of the region, under the British Raj, borders were often intended to be set by watersheds, by where the waters parted and flowed into different regions. But the remoteness of these border regions shared by India and Pakistan and China was such that the ability to actually map accurately where the water divides, where the watersheds actually fell, was quite limited. So many of the boundaries, including the current line of actual control, are undemarcated, are undefined, and could be drawn in different fashions depending on the interests and perspectives of the parties to the conflict. So there's a great deal of murkiness in the administration of these border regions, and I look forward to questions and discussions about the more specific relationships between the border clashes and water resources in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Very helpful. Just let me start my camera first here. Thanks for a very insightful presentation. Dr. Kureen, would you be, you're next. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Bharat, and warm greetings to everyone. Delighted to be here today. Apologies for my bad throat. There's no getting away from the Delhi smog, I'm afraid. I'd like to begin by thanking both Bharat and Mandeep and their colleagues at the Asian Institute and the Asian Institute and the Institute for Water Innovation for convening this conversation today. Frankly, I cannot think of a more appropriate time to be having a conversation like this, particularly at a time when the pandemic is crossing borders at will and irrevocably changing the way we process risk and forcing us to essentially radically rethink questions of benefit sharing, trade-offs, and risk allocations. All these challenges are fundamentally moot questions in any transboundary context. So, and I'd like to also thank David for blending both the big picture as well as the granular in your presentation. I couldn't have asked for a better start. So what I'd like to do in my presentation today is to engage with two questions. The first is really to look at what is wrong with the India-China conversation on the Brahmaputra. And second, I'd like to look at in what ways can we reframe this conversation to bring a set of missing issues and actors back onto the agenda. So let me get started with the first question about what is essentially wrong with the India-China conversation on the Brahmaputra. And what strikes me most, what is most striking is how much it appears designed to fail, as it were. Now, this is ironically not on account of a lack of cooperation, but it really has a lot to do, more to do with the nature of the kind of cooperation these two countries have engaged in and the kind of choices that they have ended up making. So let me give a couple of quick examples to substantiate. take a look at the bunch of MOUs that India and China have entered into since 2002 and periodically revised every 5 years, which are for sharing hydrological data on the Brahmaputra. And what is most striking about this is these bunch of agreements is its transactional nature. India, for instance, pays about rupees 82 lakhs annually, which is approximately $108,000 annually to China to fetch this data, flood data for it from 3 stations in Tibet. So in and of itself, in principle, of course, this information is valuable. It can save lives in downstream countries. But recent studies have also started pointing out, raising serious questions about the usefulness of this data that India buys from China, essentially on account of the fact that these are and the 3 stations in Tibet are in rain shadow areas. So, so that's the and then, as I mentioned, these agreements are essentially for a duration of 5 years, which means these have to be renegotiated regularly in order to be functional. And so there is no automatic sort of renewal. Be that as it may, what is also what these agreements really do not entail is any form of legal guarantees or joint mechanisms or any treaty whatsoever. In fact, the Indian Prime Minister back then in 2013, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was publicly snubbed by the Chinese president when he suggested during his first meeting with him, when he suggested the idea of a joint mechanism, and he was told that the present arrangements work just as fine. So. And now perhaps that what is most incongruous and most odd about the entire discourse on the Brahmaputra really is that it has been reduced to becoming a single issue debate, fixated on diversion. So there's this entire paranoia in India about that is obsessed about whether whether China will divert the waters of the Brahmaputra or not. Now, while quantity and diversion are valid concerns, this obsession with diversion, I would like to argue, ends up virtually diverting the very debate itself. And let's take and as a result of that, there are a whole bunch of issues that ought to have found a place on the agenda, but do not, given the fact that we are fixated with diversion. So what exactly are some of these issues that ought to have been on the agenda, but no one seems to be interested in shining a light on these? So, and I think this first of these would be, for instance, the issue of water quality, which is going to increasingly become salient in the transboundary region, and even domestically within China, you have increasing concern about the quality of waters being given the severe environmental degradation. For instance, even in water-starved cities like Beijing, have started declining or refusing to accept waters that have been pumped from the southern rivers as part of the south to north water diversion scheme on account of severe pollution. Now, we also have research coming from Chinese scientists, which is pointing to transboundary implications of environmental degradation and rampant mining that is taking place in the Three Rivers area situated in central Tibet. And this points to, and which is one of the rivers is the Yarlung Sangpo, the Brahmaputra is part of the three rivers, the others being the Lhasa River and Nanchu. So these studies are increasingly pointing to high incidence of heavy metals and tailings, which are finding their way downstream. So water quality, I would say, is one of those issues that has completely not been placed on the agenda. The second is dam-induced, the danger posed by dam-induced earthquakes. This is a threat that is really hiding in plain sight and is almost self-evident given the fact that the Himalayas are young-fold mountains and are seismically very active. But if any warning were needed, recent research by Chinese scientists also have drawn a very disturbing and direct link between the devastating earthquake in Sichuan, which claimed in 2008, which claimed 80,000 lives, to the Sipingpu Dam in Sichuan. So what this raises the third missing issue that I'd like to flag, which is what will be the cumulative impact of all this dam building that is taking place in the Himalayan region. Frankly, no one knows, and I'm not sure anyone cares. And we simply do not know about what could be the cumulative impact, and what could be, and further related question could be, what will be the cumulative impact of a bunch of run-of-the-river projects that are, there is this feel-good narrative about ROR projects being billed as essentially benign and having no environmental adverse effects, as it were. But again, when we look at what will be the cumulative impact of ROR projects, again, no one knows, because there's this, as I said, uncritical assumption of these ROR projects being benign. But there's evidence, enough and more evidence to press pause, and we need, and one example is the fate that met the Pakmun Dam in Thailand, which began its life as a ROR, built as an ROR project, but which functioned essentially as a storage dam. And to cut long story short, it ended up destroying the country's richest freshwater fisheries in a span of 2 years. So, so what could be the current, the impact of the current standoff between India and China on these agreements that and the agreements that India and China have signed? And so as you can see, for the reasons that I mentioned, it's not very encouraging. But we don't also need any hypothetical or speculative exercises to understand what its possible impact could be, because in an exact sort of copycat situation played out in 2017 during the India-China standoff in Doklam, where in 2017 China decides not to share flood data with India, citing technical reasons, but went ahead and then goes ahead and shares the same data on the same river to downstream Bangladesh. So that is, so you see the kind of, in terms of when you peel off the feel-good narrative about India-China cooperation and the MOUs of functional cooperation, you end up finding that these are on very shaky legs. So all in all, just to recapitulate, in terms of choices, you see it has been a case of aiming low and hitting lower. Now, what is puzzling about this really is that one would have expected, one would have thought that India would have huge stakes in initiating processes of desecuritization, but its attempts at desecuritization have been half-hearted at best. So what explains this paradox? One possible reason could be that that India itself is heavily invested in the securitization narrative, and it has leveraged this very skillfully to justify its own dam building projects, in particularly in Northeast India, by playing on the concerns of scarcity and suggestions, and has advanced ideas such as first user rights, that China has never given any indication of adhering to norms of such a norm. So, and just to validate this, you see in recent weeks, Arunachal Pradesh, the India's border state, announcing a restart of its dam building sprees, and there are about 169 hydropower projects on the anvil. So brings me to the burden of proof about how do we break this freeze frame. Then there are two possible pathways I'd like to flag. One is to really question the capital-centric conversation on this transboundary Delhi, and for far too long we have privileged. This has ended up privileging a dominant reading of the Brahmaputra through a geopolitical lens, and as a result, we have ended up with a very distorted as a reading that has nudged out alternative imaginations and multiple readings of the river. So we must reclaim these if we want to reframe this debate and shine a light on these. So how do we do that? I would say by bringing, one way could be by bringing scale back into the conversation, by inverting the gaze, by looking at subnational, what are essentially subnational imaginations of the river, and to look at how Indian border states are, how are they articulate, and what are their articulations of the river, and it's because this is the spatial logic is there for a certain reason, because the border states are at the receiving end of a range of transboundary goods and bads, and especially at the receiving end of floods, and who are most directly affected and therefore have the most direct stakes in investing in desecuritization moves. And when we rescale the conversation, interesting benefit sharing models really emerge. Very interesting and benefit sharing models emerge. And an interesting example two quick examples, and I'll wrap up with this. Example by the Indian border state Assam, which Assam has signed with Bangladesh to revive trade, the movement of freight and people by resuming inland waterways in the region, and which is historically waterways have played a great role in bridging, and this is essentially reviving and has the potential to reconnect economic geographies. The second possible pathway to reframe the question, the debate would be to, I think we must also question a certain hierarchy of rivers, as it were, where we tend to privilege the big river to the exclusion of any number of tributaries and small rivers to the. And as you know, one is there are very interesting examples of transboundary collective action that are filling the gaps of that take place as a result of this neglect at the formal level to look at these the smaller tributaries. One recent example is a cooperation between villages on both sides of India and Bhutan. Bhutan, incidentally, just to mention, is also part of the Brahmaputra basin. So villages on both sides of Bhutan recently cooperated place an early warning flood warning mechanism by using WhatsApp messages, which has been phenomenally successful in saving lives and exchanging real-time information. So I think, and this is on the Saralbanga river, which flows from Bhutan. So, so as we can see, there are two distinct imaginations of the river. One which sees it as a metaphor for conflict, and the other as a metaphor for cooperation. And the point is really that these are not stark binaries. These need not be binaries. And these are not essentially antithetical to each other and could intersect to offer a very interesting co-governance opportunities. So the short point is this, and I'd like to end with this. A river runs through these fundamental questions of benefit sharing, risk allocation, and trade-offs that require not just a dialogue between countries, but also a dialogue internally between the federal and subnational levels. And that it is this conversation that we need to start now. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kurian, for that very nuanced description of what is going on within the geopolitics of transboundary waters. Now we have Professor Zafar Adil. Zafar, you could take up to 20 minutes. I know we are a little beyond, but you could cover your territory well within 20 minutes. So thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bharat. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to you, thanks to University of Toronto, to Mandeep for organizing this very interesting conversation. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that SFU operates on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I'm physically located on the territories of Coquitlam and Katsiye First Nations. So we're very grateful to be here on their traditional lands. So I would like to talk about the securitization of waters in South Asia, and I'll start by looking at a global picture and then zoom into South Asia specifically. I'll use the Indus Basin, with which I'm most familiar, as kind of a facsimile for the region as a whole, and we'll see that the challenges are probably quite similar across other river basins in South Asia too. What I will do is, in addition to pointing out what the challenges are, also look at how we can reimagine the situation and what potential opportunities are which can be availed to change the scenario. So let's start with looking at the global picture on water security and securitization. I find it very interesting that in the last few years, there has been a number of UN Security Council debates on water security specifically, and to look at how water can be a driver and a catalyst for cooperation, and let us move away from conflict by using that mechanism. Historically, UN Security Council, while many of us in the international water community have pushed them to look into this question, they've kind of shied away from it. So I find it quite encouraging that at the global scale, this recognition is coming. Part of the reason for this recognition is also when you look at the global leadership and their perceptions of what risks and challenges are there, give water a high priority. Here's a ranking of global challenges done by global leaders that gather in Davos every year at the World Economic Forum. So these are both political leaders and business leaders, and they are polled each year to define what challenges are high impact on the global scale and what are most likely. And you see here I've circled water crises, which has figured, at least for the last 7 years, in the top 5 categories as a major challenge. But I won't actually stop there, because there's a number of other things which are in this top right-hand quadrant, which also relate to water crisis. When you think of extreme weather events, natural disasters, including floods, climate action failure, and man-made environmental disasters, all of them relate to water at one level or the other. So I think it is this recognition that's driving the international attention to it. One significant way in this increased level of attention is a report that was done in 2012 by the US intelligence community. And they did a global scan of transboundary river basins, and they tried to figure out where the challenges were and where these challenges posed a threat to the US own strategic agendas. And what was interesting from this analysis is that the Indus and the Brahmaputra basins came out as 2 major river systems where there are significant threats. In the Indus basin, and I'll talk a lot more about it in a moment, the problems with food security and the resilience to floods and droughts almost being non-existent are main concerns. But there is moderate capacity, particularly because there is this Indus Water Treaty in place. Similarly, for Brahmaputra, because there is no treaty at the moment, and there are these unilateral project developments ongoing, there's food security issues, the capacity is actually inadequate, and so it actually even poses a higher risk. What I find interesting is, and this was an analysis done by intelligence experts, not by water experts. So they, recognize that in the next 10 years, there would be internal stability in many states, and water shortages might become more acute. And food security is quite central to that. And as countries rely more and more on groundwater, there is the realization that water insecurity becomes a lever for what happens in the global food markets. You can also flip that around and say, because the largest usage is by agriculture, you can actually reduce that water threat by better managing the water in the agriculture system. Just as a footnote, this report came out in early 2012, and at about the same time, the situation in Syria started unraveling, and the Euphrates basin was also recognized as an area under threat. And that seems to actually pretty much follow this pattern that was laid out in this report. Now let's focus in on the Indus Basin, and I'm very grateful to both David and Nimi for laying out the lay of the land, so to speak. Just some basics. So there is, in terms of the land area or the surface area in the basin, about half of it lies in Pakistan, 40% or 39% to be precise in India, 8% in China, and 6% in Afghanistan. The key element here is that there is an Indus Water Treaty that was signed in 1960 with the cooperation and support of the World Bank, which gave the essentially the control of the three eastern rivers, I should say, Sutlej, Beas, and Ravi were where the control was given to India, and the remaining rivers remained under Pakistani control, if I can oversimplify it. And there was a mechanism set for India to provide reparations to Pakistan for the water that it was basically controlling from Ravi and Sutlej rivers. And what is interesting is that this treaty has held through, almost 60 years now, and it has held through even when there was active acts of war and armed conflict going on between the two countries. So in that sense, it has been fairly durable. But as we'll look at in a minute, some of that durability, I think, is being chipped at, and we need to really take a serious look at how to move forward. So some of the challenges, and I think David already outlined those, I don't need to dwell too much on these. There are climate change patterns which are going to affect water availability. They might actually increase the water as glaciers melt faster in the next couple of decades, and then it would really slow down. I think the main challenge is that the population growth has been quite significant, and when the Indus Water Treaty was signed, we were dealing with excess of water, something like over 5,000 cubic meters per person per year, whereas now we are actually less than 1,000 cubic meters per person per year in the Indus Basin. So that has very severe consequences for water security. And there are increasing environmental impacts. You already saw David show some maps on how groundwater is being depleted through basically uncontrolled withdrawals for agricultural production. There are some fundamental challenges to Indus Water Treaty as well, and as I mentioned a moment ago, there is a lack of cooperative management. I think that's the underlying challenge. Because when the negotiations started in 1950s, the idea was that the two countries would jointly manage the system as a whole. What came out in 1960 was essentially another partition of the river basin. And so that's one challenge. And then, of course, as I said, there was excess of water at the time. Now there's scarcity. And there have been a number of disputes that have cropped up, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years. Some of them have resulted in cases being taken to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, to the International Court of Justice, etc. And there's, you already heard, quite a few new dams also being planned by India. And again, how it impacts the treaty is not really very well understood. Nimi mentioned water quality measures, because when the treaty was signed in 1960, water quality was not really a major concern, so there's not really much in the treaty. And of course, Afghanistan and China are not included in the treaty at all. And there is significant interest in dam building on the Chinese side. So that's obviously something that needs to be looked at. And at the moment, there are some plans on paper on the Afghanistan side on the Kabul River that eventually merges into the Indus River. So how these play out in the absence of a treaty is, of course, a bit of a concern. And I'll look at this water stress in the region in a slightly different way compared to what David had already presented. This is a map produced by the World Resources Institute, and they look at the year 2040 in terms of what the stress will look like. and compared to the available water. So you can see pretty much all of this region is going to have a very high level of, extremely high level of water stress, unless we start to do things differently. There are obviously underlying political realities, and I think Mimi pointed to some of those. I'll reiterate them here, that any efforts to foster water cooperation have to go against this a number of handicaps which are complex, which are diverse, and part of the reason is that conflict is quite deeply ingrained in this river system, and there's a bit of resistance to changing it. And you know, despite these difficulties, there are quite a few cooperative instruments, and I'll particularly talk about three potential opportunities in a moment. And I think that these are certainly within the realm of possibility in achieving those. And you know, to not to put too fine a point on it, the four riparian countries have to pay attention, and if they don't, then the price for non-cooperation is going to be quite high in terms of social and economic issues, as well as political and strategic ones. So there is strong interest in rethinking how we engage in the basin. So here's the first area where there is cooperation eminently possible, which is to jointly respond to water-related disasters, and most prominently to floods. In the last decade, there have been a number of major events which neither of the countries, India or Pakistan, have been able to appropriately and adequately respond to. And we think that there is an ample opportunity to focus on this disaster risk reduction, and to that will help indirectly overcome the trust deficit that exists. In order to do this, you obviously need to have real-time data sharing, and there's lots of satellite-based and remote sensing technologies that can be used, which sort of bypass the typical securitization of data sets in themselves. And to connect this information to end users, particularly to agricultural system, to public health, and to the energy sectors, that's an interesting way of making good use of these you know, data sharing tools. And jointly, if you pool the capacity together for all the South Asian countries, you know, there is enough capacity to respond to those, and that can help build the human capital as well. The second main area is sharing of energy grids, which is kind of an interesting fact that most of the larger regions in the world, including the one where I'm sitting at right now, share energy grids with their neighbors. It's kind of unusual in the South Asian subcontinent that doesn't happen, but there's nothing preventing us from going in that direction. And I would argue, these shared grids would actually help with holistic negotiations around water resource management, and will help reduce energy deficits as well. And you know, indirectly, they will also help the engagement of the international community through increases in overseas development assistance, as well as foreign direct investment. The third main area through which we can think about cooperation is opening up even more some trade opportunities. Now, there is significant trade of food and crops across the borders, but actually that can be significantly changed by increasing joint trade, and there's lots of free trade examples around the world to look at. And I think indirectly it can help build goodwill and mutual confidence. And that should make ample sense, because the size of the economic market in South Asia is larger than European Union. And we are underutilizing it because of these conflicts. So I think business may be a different entry point to look at how these issues are addressed. And we can even think of using Indus Basin for navigational purposes, which actually doesn't happen to any significant extent at the moment. And again, this region is somewhat unique in the world that we don't fully avail that opportunity. So these three options, responding to disasters, sharing energy grids, and opening up trade opportunities, I think are amply reasonable starting points through which cooperation can take place. I do want to spend a few moments talking about revising the Indus Water Treaty, and by including these aspects of climate change and water quality issues, including China and Afghanistan, into the equation. And you can look at it both from an Indian lens and a Pakistani lens on why these should be done. From an Indian perspective, it helps increase regional security and even Indian influence, and particularly in the context of the Kashmir's conflict, which has dragged on for a long time, and to secure energy. So there's about 33 hydroelectric projects which are in various stages of planning in Kashmir alone. And that can help boost India's economic footprint by opening up particularly these trade regimes, if you will. And India can emerge as a leader both in water security and management, as well as in responding to climate change. On the Pakistani side, because the agricultural production and food security and even urban growth is related to water security in the Indus Basin, it is inherently important for Pakistan to renegotiate and to look at what changing climate conditions are. It can also help develop in a more structured way ties with China and Afghanistan, and that can help structure long-term relationship. At the moment, the energy generation in Pakistan, the potential, I think, is about 20,000 megawatts, which is about 2/3 of it is not hydropower. And by re-envisioning the energy availability can greatly increase, and it can eventually lead to increased economic opportunities as well. So here's my sort of parting shot, so to speak. Why should the world care? Why the international community should pay attention to what's happening in the Indus Basin, and more broadly to securitization of water in South Asia. So to state the obvious, 3 of the top 10 armies in the world are here, 3 nuclear armed states are here, and there's decade-long armed conflict taking place in both Kashmir and Afghanistan. There are energy corridors that can be built, and again, they have global consequences for doing that. And there are other geopolitical considerations, which hopefully we can discuss more in detail in how China is emerging as a globally dominant power. The second point is that there is obviously a history of armed conflict, both between India, China, and more recently between India and China, as we were discussing. So we want to contain these potentials and to look at the situation a bit differently. And finally, we have to also think about the risk of political instability and how we go around that in a serious way. And there's a number of ways in which the world can engage, provide international assistance, broker relationships, maybe use the SDG frameworks for solving the water security issues. And a number of the international organizations are already engaged in this process. So I'll stop here and pass the floor back to you, Bharat.
Thank you, Adil. Very, very fascinating presentations. Thank you very much. I noticed that there was almost like a consensus between all 3 panelists that that things need to move on the waterfront, and how all 3 countries, especially the larger powers, as Adil just mentioned, India, China, and Pakistan, have to think out of the box and possibly use economics, culture, as a lever, to develop develop a kind of broad agreement on cooperation. I would reiterate, if there are questions from the audience, you could send them through the chat box. But as we get those questions, I had a few questions of my own, and also if if the panelists want to ask each other questions at a time, so it's good to catch up. This is a question I had for all the panelists. I share the belief that greater economic cooperation can lead, and interdependence can lead to more durable solutions on water. But is that enough? I mean, how far will that take us? Given that we saw that India and China had very vibrant trade relationship, though it was in China's favor, but that's not the point. What about the politics? I mean, do we set aside the politics? I mean, the Kashmir dispute, for instance, is the kind of elephant in the room. So what I was wanting to ask y'all, since y'all y'all engage in this kind of transboundary water research from a geopolitical lens, is do we approach border disputes? How do we approach border? Do we wait to solve border disputes before we approach water, or should we start with water and then go to border disputes? Maybe this is not a very great question, but I thought I'd ask it. Yes, Adil.
I'll stick my neck out and try to answer. I think generally speaking, starting with your first point, that whether economic cooperation is enough in itself and whether that will lead to other things or not, and I think the implication in your question is correct, that there are very severe and enormous political mountains that you have to climb. But in order to get there, you have to start somewhere. And I think economics is a much more convenient and politically expedient starting point, because each of and if I just talk about for a moment for the three large countries, for each of them, the political leadership can actually benefit by selling it to their public that economic cooperation is creating more jobs, it's creating better livelihoods. And I think that opens up the door. You could almost say that it's a bit of a Trojan horse through which you could start cooperation on others. And if you flip it around the other way, if you don't have that economic cooperation, we've seen for decades just going directly at the political solutions is not yielding the ideal results.
David?
No, I would agree that I think it's certainly the case that the political tensions and the political backgrounds around the territorial disputes that are embodied in the border clashes are more serious than the strictly water-related disputes. The territorial disputes predate the rising water stresses, and I would postulate would also outlast them. That if the water supply questions were somehow resolved either by technology or by the impacts of climate change, the territorial questions around sovereignty in Jammu and Kashmir, Arunachal Pradesh, Aksai Chin, these questions would remain. So the possibilities for water cooperation, I believe, provide traction in promoting greater political cooperation, but are not, to my mind, the key to resolving the overarching territorial disputes. But for the reasons that the other panelists mentioned, and the cooperative benefits that Adil stressed in particular, that there is a a persuasive logic to pursuing degrees of water cooperation in data sharing, in disaster management and preparation that provide common benefits to all of the riparians, whether upstream or downstream, or whether more or less politically powerful in the region or not. That suitably developed and environmentally responsible cooperation over hydropower, for example, it not only provides potential benefits to India as a consuming market, to take the case of Nepal and Bhutan, but also provides economic benefits to Nepal and Bhutan as being suppliers of power, hydropower, in these potential opportunities for enlarging and taking advantage of shared energy grids and shared power production. And the real obstacles there, and which is manifested by the difference between the way Bhutan as related to India around hydropower and Nepal, for example, the real obstacles there are those political challenges that you just mentioned.
Right.
The lack of trust, the historical frictions behind the development of the water resources in the region, and these, it's true that they are all in ways connected to territorial issues, but the control over the water resources is not the primary mover of those territorial disputes. So
okay.
Nimi evoked the border confrontation in Doklam between Nepal and India. There are disputes over the Kalapani district, which is part of the Mahakali Sharda watershed. But the fact that water is a component of these disputes, both for the better and for worse, both as a source of tension and both as a source of cooperation, does not entail that water is the key or the sole component to resolving the territorial issues, which I think surround and would outlast water cooperation. But the bottom line is that water cooperation does provide the opportunity to furnish mutual benefits for all sides, and I think it's persuasive logic to develop it for that reason alone.
Dr. Kurian, do you have a take on this?
So just to add to what David said, it is true that territory has been a virtual conversation stopper in India-China relations, and there is a part of the reason we get the India-China story wrong is because we tend to ignore, or rather don't look at adequately enough at the ideational muddle that sits at front and square at the heart of this relationship, or their attempts at what has to do with, I would say, their very different conceptions of peace. And to a great extent, the limitation has been that India and China, their attempts at the confidence building measures have attempted conflict prevention and have not, and all their CBMs have really aimed at conflict prevention, but have not segued to the higher order goal of conflict transformation. So which is why Galwan recently was a costly reminder that conflict prevention can only imitate conditions of peace and cannot really replace, can seldom be a durable one. So I think politics really sits at the front and square of this, and which is why economics, while it gives definitely a feel-good narrative of, and I can invoke the former minister Jairam Ramesh's pet phrase back then of Chindia, never came to fruit because there were these central contradictions that they are either not inclined to look at or are never, they're simply not, there's simply no interest in trying to resolve these. And to understand that there is politics that sits there, they are not innocent of these, but there's a politicality to why they remain unresolved.
Right. Thank you. Very, very insightful answers again. There's a question coming through the Q&A chat box, which is, where we've spoken a great deal on India, China, and Pakistan. Understandably, they're very big countries and important countries, and they have very significant disputes between each other. But what about the smaller countries? And the question is, what about Bangladesh? Where does it stand, for instance, in the India-China relationship on the Brahmaputra? Does Bangladesh have separate water treaties with India on the Brahmaputra?
Not on the Brahmaputra.
Okay.
Not on the Brahmaputra, but on the Ganges, they do. And part of the political challenges and the cooperative challenges that we've evoked across this discussion revolve around the shortfalls and the inadequacies of even those cooperative institutions that we do possess. So Adil spoke about how, for example, two of the riparians in the Indus system, Afghanistan and China, are not part of the Indus Waters Treaty equation. And likewise, that the IWT being signed in 1960 predates awareness and concerns about climate change or awareness and concerns about water quality. And the same could be said for the other institutional arrangements that exist across the region, the Ganges Treaty between India and Bangladesh, or the Mahakali Treaty between India and Nepal, that part of the challenges in capitalizing on broader cooperative opportunities through those institutional mechanisms are that they do not necessarily include all of the relevant stakeholders, or that they do not have provisions for addressing what are now becoming increasingly important issues of disaster management, climate resilience, or water quality, and that the political obstacles and challenges which Nimi so ably highlighted, in fact, in some ways confound the ability to adapt those institutions to the emerging challenges. That it is in part because of the political tensions between India and Nepal, the mistrust over historical attempts to develop hydropower that frustrates adapting the Mahakali Treaty to address emerging challenges. Likewise with the IWT, that the ongoing, the enduring tensions between India and Pakistan make both parties reluctant to reopen that Pandora's box and renegotiate it or modify it to address the emerging challenges. So one of the stumbling blocks for the engagement of the smaller countries around these issues is the power asymmetries and the institutional asymmetries that impede or in part impede cooperative engagement with them, and then that these countries too become embroiled in the larger geopolitical picture. So there's a competition in some ways between China and India for influence in Nepal, or one could only needs to take a look at the concerns that Pakistan has voiced over perceived Indian assistance to water resources management and development in the Kabul basin in Afghanistan. That because the Kabul flows into the Indus system, Pakistan is concerned that Indian efforts to assist Afghanistan's development of its water resources are part of an encirclement strategy, whereby India would be in a position to throttle Pakistan's water development, both from the east and the Indus system and from the west through the Kabul. So it's unfortunately the case that the smaller countries in the region are disadvantaged by these political dynamics.
Adil, some years back you came up with this, you coined a new phrase, Hindustan. Could you tell us a little more about how that relates to the question being asked on, how we could make smaller countries part of a larger kind of subcontinent arrangement on water?
Yeah, thanks, Bharat. We sort of coined this term for a book that was published about 3 years ago. And we said, imagining Hindustan, and it goes back to the notion that the partition of the subcontinent after the British colonial period ended ended up drawing these lines that crisscross the basin. And, the political underpinnings have made it difficult to see beyond that and how cooperatively things can be managed. And we came out with those 3 areas of cooperation, among others, that were possible. So, conceptually, that's something that we can strive towards and think about. I do want to bring in another element here in the conversation, and that is the way China has been engaging with all of its transboundary rivers, not just with Indus or Brahmaputra. And that has been that either it has, when we think of, for example, Mekong River or the Salamine River, that they have either not participated in regional discussions, or they have preferred to have just bilateral arrangements between the immediate downstream countries. And I think that's a behavior that I think China will realize has to change, because it does pose a significant limitation in terms of engaging into these larger agreements that would involve, for example, Afghanistan also for the Indus Basin, and which would involve Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh on the, and I look at Ganges Brahmaputra as a coupled system. And there is a growing sort of intellectual community inside of China that is challenging that Chinese approach and mindset of having only bilateral collaborations, and I can only hope that will change the dynamics, and we would again use the water cooperation as a lever to open up other problems and other more persistent political issues.
Dr. Kurian, did you have a quick answer to that? No. Related to the point Adil just made, there's a question again coming through the chat box by Rick Wilson. And what incentives to China can we identify in increasing its cooperation on water issues with the downstream countries? Can we present China with some incentives on why? You just mentioned one, Adil, and are there other changes in the Chinese kind of outlook and policy on water, which Nimi also highlighted some new scientific thinking in China on dams and new perception of risk. Is there anything else beyond that which you think is important? Adil, yes.
Well, the other thing that comes to mind is China's sort of geopolitical dominance, and I think the manifestation of this is the Belt and Road Initiative, and its further sub-manifestations include the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And any political instability poses a severe risk to this sort of revival of the Silk trade route, is kind of how it started about 20 years ago as a notion, and now it's transmogrified into Belt and Road Initiative, and it plugs in quite directly to China's geopolitical ambitions, and I think you can speak that language to the Chinese leadership to say, you have to really rethink how you're engaging with the potential, how should I say, clients in this Belt and Road Initiative, and water is a significant component. You can't continually bypass it and still hope to achieve success in that sort of geopolitical dimension of its own strategy.
Dr. Kurian? Yes. Please go ahead, Dr. Kurian. Yeah.
Yes, so that's a great question from Rick. I think it's very interesting when you look at there are subtle shifts in China's public diplomacy where in its engagement with, for instance, Southeast Asian countries on the Mekong, that could offer some takeaways on what broadly could be perceived by China as incentives for good behavior on its part, despite its hegemonic position as an upper riparian. And the interesting instances are where China also recently, I think earlier this month, also there are moves by China, and this has got more to do with, I think, the intangible being very important for China, which is the need to the optic of maintaining its public image as a responsible and a responsive power, which is increasingly gaining credence, at least rhetorically, within Chinese debates. And as a result of these, what we see are some very interesting, tangible sort of shifts, which we can, at the present moment, can see as very gradual, but nonetheless do add up to some, which is to, for instance, offer, and this is all in the face of very strong anti-China sentiment within regional sentiment, which is gathering force in Southeast Asia, in Southeast Asian countries, about China's dam building activities. So the steps that China has actually done is first to provide dry season flows on the river to of the Mekong to the downstream countries, which is something which India has asked for and we haven't received. But this is it's very interesting how a small set of small countries is able to effectively and more effectively negotiate and get some of these bargains struck. So one is this, where China provides dry season flows on the Mekong. The second is it has allowed, I don't know to what extent this is being backed by, whether it's been implemented, but has gone ahead and allowed for inspections to many of the sites in China where dam building is taking place.
Okay.
As I said, I would be more skeptical at this point. I'd see these as subtle shifts in its public diplomacy, which is more, as a result of an interest in maintaining its image. And so the image consciousness or the image problem that China is dealing with is also resulting in some of these sort of shifts that one can see.
Okay, so related to that, I mean, you mentioned the importance of the subnational, and if I connect that to the question on China, is it true that China is also involved with Indian universities like IIT Guwahati in funding research on the Brahmaputra?
I honestly don't know that whether they.
Yeah, I had just seen some literature on that. Are there other questions which the panelists would like to? We are quickly approaching the end. I'll just I mean, we don't seem to have other questions. This has been a terrific discussion. And you have in your own ways identified some of the paths these countries could take towards forging a kind of shared understanding around water in the Himalayas. The Himalayas being very important, they're also called the third pole, and we hope that this current crisis between India and China, but also the kind of saber rattling between India and Pakistan, will give way to more common sense and a better understanding of what a cooperative future can bring on. So on that note, I want to thank Adil, for joining us so early from Vancouver. It's quite early in Vancouver. David and Nemi, and also to Dasha and the Asian Institute for helping us organize this, and to the Institute of Water Innovation, Mandeep at the Institute of Water Innovation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bharat.